hopefully I'll make it worth your time. I'm Jenny, if you don't know me, and my presentation is going to be on psychedelics in these various fields, medicine, AI, and in terms of our society. So I'm sure maybe, oh, well, since the topic list was released, you probably saw this in the topics. I'm curious as to how much some of you might know about psychedelics, or like what your impressions are, if anyone has any input.
I literally don't know anything about psychedelics.
Okay, great.
So I'll learn more
Okay,
today.
hopefully I'll teach you some things. Well, so what are they? They are typically classed into these two classes as classical hallucinogens and non-classical. The classical hallucinogens are named this way because mainly of their action on a specific serotonin receptor, which is called serotonin receptor 5-HT2A. And some examples are psilocybin, which are mushrooms, magic mushrooms, lysergic acid diethylamide, which is LSD, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, those first two, mescaline, and DMT, just some examples. And this is the structure of LSD, and that is the structure of psilocybin. And so you can see there are some similarities, which might explain why they act in a similar mechanism in the body. However, I should say, these substances are by no means acting in the exact same way, I mean, as they are different compounds, so that makes sense. But, so in terms of the non-classical hallucinogens, which I won't really be touching on too much other than maybe ketamine, because it will be relevant later. So yeah, we have ketamine, salvia, and ayahuasca. And interestingly enough, ayahuasca is kind of an ancient drink. It's a tea that's brewed from the plant, I can't think of the species name right now, it's too long, but from the plant vine, and it actually contains this hallucinogenic substance, DMT, which is, so I think it's generally regarded as a very powerful kind of hallucinogen, and many indigenous groups have actually been using it for a long time. Like, there's a recorded use centuries ago mainly for spiritual kind of ceremonial purposes. And yeah, okay, I'll get into each of these, or some of these more later, but I just wanted to touch on some of the mechanisms in which they act in our body. And so this, I don't know if you can see it that well, but this is basically just trying to say that LSD, as an example, has a bunch of targets in our central nervous systems. And like I said before, the main target is the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. So when LSD binds to this receptor, it will cause a cascade of reactions, and the recruitment of these two channels right here, or receptors as well, NMDAR and AMPAR, which eventually will increase the extracellular levels of our glutamate. So the glutamate in our brains will increase. And in addition to that, the serotonin levels will increase as well. I'm not going to go into all of these mechanisms because it's a lot. And it makes sense that such a compound would act on so many different mechanisms just because of what it does to our bodies, really. In this image, you can see a placebo brain without LSD, and then treated with LSD, scanned by fMRI. It shows a lot more connectivity and suppressing, actually, the ego center of our brain, which, as Anastasia was talking about, unfortunately she's not here, but in her presentation, self-awareness comes from that area of the brain, and LSD actually kind of suppresses that, which is interesting because you would think when you have so much connectivity, why would anything be suppressed? Well, turns out a lot of people that use these psychoactive substances, these experiences can actually be really life-changing. Typically, people that have a positive experience might report feelings of increased openness and acceptance and less of that barrier between yourself and the world. So maybe becoming more selfless, understanding other people's cultures, religions, and so on and so forth. And as I will get into, we can use these in medicine for treatment of things like depression, anxiety, addiction, OCD, and PTSD. That's not all of the disorders that have been tested, it's just some of them. And again, this might be kind of surprising because typically psychedelics are kind of associated with illicit drug use and the movement in the 60s where hippies were taking these kinds of substances, and they might outwardly appear different or strange to people that may not understand these drugs. And so, yeah, so in the case of depression, I want to focus on this one because there has been a study that has been done quite recently, in 2016, I believe. I have figures on the next slide. But so in depression, what happens in your brain as part of its pathophysiology is that the neurons in your prefrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain, kind of degenerate a little bit, or there's atrophy of these neurons. So they're not the way they should be in a non-depressed patient. And so I will come back to this slide, but just to finish this point on depression, all of these graphs are kind of, so this is from that clinical study, Ross, and in 2016. So all of these graphs are showing different measures of depression, anxiety levels. They are all kind of self-surveys that are kind of standardized throughout mental healthcare, I guess. So they basically, how they did this clinical study is it's double-blinded, which means that the experimenter, the person that is, the administrator, the person that is giving the drug, and the patient do not know what drug they're getting. So this is obviously good, so that eliminates a little bit of bias. And then that leads to, they obviously had to have a control drug, and the control drug they chose was niacin, just to simulate the kind of physical effects that psilocybin would give, which is the one they used in the studies, the mushrooms. And it was also a double-blind crossover experiment. So this graph is the same as this one, except the data shown in the previous graphs were just going up to here. So the blue lines in all of these graphs are the group of patients that got treated first with the placebo, niacin, and not psilocybin. So they didn't know, which drug they were getting, and the administrators also didn't know which drug they were giving. So as you can see, this says, it's probably too small to see, baseline, 1 day pre, post, 6 weeks post. So when you look at the group that got the placebo first, there's kind of like a little bit of decrease after they got administered the drug, which is the first green line. But overall, not really that much. But then when you compare it to the psilocybin-treated group, you can see there is quite a drastic decrease. So this would correspond to a better mental health state as reported by the patients themselves. And now this is where that crossover part of the study comes in, because at this second green line, that is when a second dose of the other drug was administered. And again, still they wouldn't have known which one it was. And so then when we look at that, once the niacin first group, so the placebo first group was treated with actual psilocybin, again, decrease in all of these clinical scores, which is great news. So basically all this is saying is that it did make a difference in these patients in terms of their depression and anxiety. And this this is a lot, so you don't have to look at that, but if you focus up here, I would have put only the 4, but then the quality was really bad. So basically what this is saying is positive behavioral change, personally meaningful experiences, spiritually significant experience, and well-being or overall life satisfaction. So they asked the participants 2 weeks and 26 weeks post this treatment. And again, blue is the placebo the group that received placebo first, and then pink is the group that received the mushrooms first. So as you can see, 2 weeks after, the group that got the mushrooms already reported increase in behavior, or positive feelings, and even spiritual significance, which is interesting when we think back to how the indigenous groups used to use that tea, ayahuasca. And then, yeah, again, niacin. So then after the first drug, they didn't get psilocybin, so there's very little participants that reported any change in, or any increase in all of these positive feelings. However, the 26 weeks post the second drug administration, so when they did get the real psilocybin, there's a really significant increase there. So now that's super exciting for the kind of prospect of using these kinds of drugs in medicine. Oh, I think I totally skipped over a very important fact, that that study was done on cancer-related psychosocial distress patients. So basically, cancer patients nearing the end, I believe, diagnosed with either stage 3 or 4 cancers of various types, nearing the end possibly of their lives, and they are experiencing a lot of distress and fear of death, which is understandable. And this is quite a common problem in hospitals, as you can imagine. And there is really seemingly almost nothing you can do about this, because counseling and therapy are kind of subjective in the terms that the patient can perceive all the advice as they wish, choose to listen, or sometimes you just can't. It's not something that you can just change. So that's why having a drug like psilocybin that gives the patient such a unique experience of visual, auditory, all kinds of sensory changes, changes in cognition and movement, and it's so profound that that's why something like this can make even such a big difference in patients that are actually nearing the end of their lives, which is all something that we have to think about sometimes. Yeah, and in addition to that, studies have been done about psychedelics and these other disorders and shown promising results, which I won't get into because that would take too long. But schizophrenia I put as a separate bullet point because it's interesting when we're kind of looking at it from the flip side. So administration of, say, LSD actually kind of mimics the symptoms of schizophrenia, which I don't know if they found that out accidentally or But upon further research, administration of LSD kind of gives a profile, one profile of schizophrenic symptoms, while administering, say, psilocybin might give another profile of schizophrenic symptoms, which include things like hallucinations and auditory hallucinations and just overall unable to kind of process logically a lot of information. And so that might sound scary in terms of psychedelics. Like, why would I ever want to use something that will literally change how I feel about the world I'm in right now? Because that is, for a lot of users, how it feels to be on psychedelics. And well, this is one example of why they can be useful, but I guess I wanted to, oh wait, I should go back, sorry, this is a mess. I just wanted to touch on how ayahuasca has been used by indigenous groups for centuries, and there's kind of a reason why these substances have been used is because how they change your perception with the world in that moment. You can, there have been people that are atheists for their whole life that come out of a psychedelic experience having experienced a sense of God, and then they will understand their peers that might be very religious even better, and they might feel more open towards these religious peers. That's one example. And yeah, so it's really, I think, I'll get into the problems with all this. Public perception plays a huge role into why these drugs aren't readily accepted into, you know, even using it in medicine, even though we have data, albeit it is quite a new area of research because it kind of got stopped in the 1900s or 1950s, and then a bunch of things happened, and now people are interested again. But public perception still kind of remains a little bit iffy. People don't really know. They think like, oh, these drugs that change my, like, how I see things and how I hear things, like that's like so scary. People might become violent. People might, you know, abuse these drugs, which I will touch on both of those points. But yeah, so that's a huge problem in terms of researching these drugs, because universities and other medical associations that might conduct these types of research won't want to put this kind of a project studying psychedelics in their research, I guess, because they might be afraid of public perception that, you know, it's kind of weird or not useful, but that's one of the problems. And that's not to say that there isn't a problem with the science that has been done on these substances so far, because a lot of them have lacked placebo controls, and a lot of people argue that the people that participate in these studies might already be biased to becoming more open-minded. Like they might willingly participate in a psychedelic study because they kind of already know what it's about, and they might already be on the more open-minded side, so they're more readily able to get the positive experiences out of the treatment. And participant numbers is also another huge thing. The study that I showed you previously only had 29 patients in it, which is not a lot in terms of statistics. However, I think that definitely is a challenge when it comes to trying to set up experiments with these substances, because they cost a lot, first of all, to import, and they are heavily restricted, and that is probably the most obvious restriction to this kind of research. So the DEA in the United States classifies the psychedelics as a Schedule I drug, which they define as having high potential for abuse and currently no accepted medical use. Now, it's actually, a lot of people have looked into whether or not psychedelics are inherently addictive, such like nicotine or opioids are, and turns out there really isn't any addictive effects. People don't undergo withdrawal symptoms or cravings after not having the drug for a long period, so really there hasn't been anything to prove that psychedelics are addictive thus far. And furthermore, there hasn't been any physiologically damaging, what's the word? There hasn't been any physiological damage caused by psychedelics that has been found. That's not to say that they will never find adverse effects like that, but as of now, and there has been quite a lot of research done on that, and so there really isn't. And so this kind of is ironic that they're put in this class for that reason already, but no currently accepted medical use. Now, well, people have been using it in clinical studies, other studies relating to psychiatry and all those mental health conditions, and it's kind of, it is again ironic that they still remain in this scheduling because clearly they have shown potential for medical use. And now one of the big problems with that is that even if a bunch of studies were done and it proved definitively that psilocybin helps depression better than current antidepressants, there's no law or anything that will change the scheduling of the drug even after they find medical uses, if that makes sense. So even if they did find medical uses, they could just keep it in here. And it's that has kind of been what's happening. Yeah, and then the Schedule 2 and 3, I just wanted to point out because these drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl are very harmful. However, they have a lower scheduling and research with these drugs is easier than research with psychedelics. Schedule 3, now ketamine is down here. And you might be surprised to see that ketamine is down there because it is a non-classical hallucinogen. It has been approved for treatment of depression recently in the United States, within the last year, I believe, where it will be administered by a doctor, and then you will have your session completely in a safe environment with supervision. And it has shown to work pretty good. So that all kind of goes to show that the scheduling of these drugs might not exactly represent how dangerous they are or anything like that, because again, cannabis again is up here as well. We've legalized cannabis in Canada, and a lot of states have legalized it as well. And there really isn't a whole bunch of research that backs the fact that cannabis is absolutely detrimental to your health. In fact, probably the opposite. It does have potential in treating a lot of diseases just like psychedelics do. So I kind of wanted to touch on again how perhaps what contributed to the whole public perception being so bad was that in the 60s, the psychedelic movement, where people started gaining access to these illicit drugs, kind of exploded, and there was that whole movement, and then it might have more been for political reasons that psychedelics were placed in Schedule I classification, rather than fear for public safety, which is again a little bit ironic. And And with the psychedelic movement, there was also, just prior actually, there was also a very controversial experiment done by the US government. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It is called MKULTRA, and it has become a little bit of an internet mystery kind of story, but it is true, and it did happen. And basically what this experiment was, it was conducted by the CIA, where they tried to, their goal was basically to attempt mind control or something of the sort, and obviously did not work. And aside from that a little bit far-fetched hypothesis, they didn't actually disclose fully to the participants of that experiment what they were doing. So that, combined with how strong psychedelics can be, would be really scary for the patients, because they're going to be experiencing all these things and have no idea what's going on. And so obviously that breaks a lot of ethical boundaries and kind of, you know, scare people off from doing this kind of research again, because the public started to take wind of it, and they started to think like, oh my gosh, like this, it's going to make everyone psychotic and yeah, whatnot. So that doesn't help. It definitely did not. Yeah, and so an example of how difficult it is to research with these drugs, MDMA, while not a psychedelic, it's kind of compared to the other ones that I've talked about in terms of its potential for medical usage. There was a study that was set to take place in Canada where they wrote up the whole protocol and everything, and it got approved by the government, and then they needed to import MDMA from Switzerland, and it took over 4 years. So that is a long time, and not only that, it is really expensive. And if you can't find anywhere to get it, because the strict laws around it kind of stop manufacturers from wanting to make the drugs in the first place. And when you have to think about when you're going to conduct a clinical trial on a large scale, ideally, you're going to need a lot of whatever it is that you're testing. So that is two major problems, because it's too expensive and nobody makes it, because legality is kind of difficult sometimes, because you have to do so much documentation and yeah. And just kind of as a thought, Portugal, I don't have anything for this, but Portugal actually decriminalized a lot of these illicit drugs, and people kind of suspected that people would start using drugs like crazy. And while that was kind of true, it wasn't like crazy, but over 7 years, drug use kind of increased a little bit, but then kind of like just stabilized. And what was interesting is that they actually found a decrease in, quote, problematic drug use, or, you know, injection of opioids or any of these potentially harmful substances, leading to regular use and then needed medical intervention. So that was interesting that even though they legalized all these drugs, not all of these drugs, but they legalized a lot of illicit drugs, and they actually kind of decreased their problem in terms of the problematic drug use. But now, I said I was going to talk about AI, so what do they have to do with AI? The Beckley Imperial Research Program is an example of a program or institution that does actually do psychedelic research currently. They kind of have a little bit of money for that, but again, it's difficult even for them. And so they are actually proposing a study that puts microdosing LSD users, which just means taking very small amounts of LSD, which can lead to increased creativity and sensory perception. I'm still having trouble speaking, but anyways. yeah, so they actually are going to pit these microdosing users against a bot designed to play Go, our favorite. So kind of like AlphaGo, except not AlphaGo because then they would all lose. So they're going to make another one, but they will put regular users against this AI to see if they do better when they're microdosing. Now, why would they kind of want to do that? Why might they think that microdosing will help with playing Go? Well, as I showed you previously, that one, brain connectivity is drastically increased when LSD is administered. And so they hypothesize that when you are more creative in a game like Go that is very complex and strategy-based and also does require a certain amount of creativity, the participants might be able to come up with new tactics or ways to play that might help them. So that will be interesting to see when the results of that come out. And the next thing I want to talk about is this. Looks really weird. That's a picture of me, made by Google's Deep Dream. And I didn't know that it would be this small, but basically Deep Dream is a program that was made by Google to kind of create these weird looking images. And if you look closely, there's like a chicken here, turned my face into like two dogs, and then there's a dog back there, and there's like some two-headed like cat dog thing. And then there's a fish there. Oh yeah, I didn't even notice that. But yeah, so very weird, very strange. Why is it doing this? So basically what the program was designed to do is kind of take an image, and it could be random noise, so like TV static, take an image, and then through layers and layers of neural networks, kind of interpret the image, and then the Google, whoever was designing the AI will put parameters. So say they wanted the bot to make a banana shape out of random noise. They actually have done that, and it doesn't work completely well, but that's not really the point, and that is why when you get all these images and you have taught the AI to recognize some number of objects, then it's kind of interesting that you give it a picture of mountains and it comes out with these very trippy looking pictures, for lack of a better term. And why is this interesting in the context of psychedelics? Because a lot of these images are kind of similar to what you might see or feel when you are under the influence of psychedelics. And this kind of, that duality between how AI and its neural networks is modeled after kind of human brains, the fact that we don't know how our brains generate these kinds of images, like seeing these kinds of images when we're on a psychedelic substance, kind of is similar to how Google may not know, or its developers may not know, exactly how these images are being generated from the original. However, they can look into that because they can separate out the layers, and as you kind of add more layers, it's going to become more complex and kind of end up like this. These images are actually very interesting because they are created from random noise, so like TV static, which is crazy. I don't know how that happened, but which basically what they told the AI to do was recognize this one part and then kind of slowly expanded it, and so it started recognizing what it created already, and then you get all these very pretty images. So yeah, and that it might be interesting that if we can find out how an AI like this makes these images, maybe it might help us understand how our brains kind of do the same thing. Or vice versa, when we study psychedelics and its effects on visual sensation, then maybe we can improve our neural networks more. Who knows? And the next thing that I have to talk about in terms of AI is our favorite, Elon Musk. And this is him on Joe Rogan's podcast. So he proposed Neuralink. I think they started working on it in 2016, and I think he showcased it. This might not be correct, but very recently in July 2019. So this technology, as Mr. Musk claims, will be a small computer chip that you implant into the brain and attach to the chip, and that will be attached to your neurons essentially, will be these really tiny microfibers that are 5 microns thick, which is 1/10 the width of a human hair, so very thin. And then he claims that it will be able to read when the neurons are firing and also stimulate them to fire. And that is very interesting in terms of what it can do for medical treatments. Because as you might be thinking right now, that has a lot of potential. It potentially could restore visual impairments, auditory impairments, even things like with psychiatric disorders, almost everything really, controlling prosthetic limbs. This is literally Elon trying to merge ourselves with AI with this little technology. I think he did actually release a paper, him and everyone else that worked on Neuralink. However, it's just all their alleged propositions, so nobody has actually, it's not peer reviewed basically. Yeah, and so another thing that is interesting that he claims this device will be able to do is telepathy. We will be able to have conversations telepathically, and that seems absolutely insane. But when you think about the reality of, if reality did actually have this technology, that wouldn't be too far-fetched, because it would be like having a way better version of all our phones just in our brain. So you could search up anything you wanted by thinking about it. You know, if I wanted to know about where this place was in Africa, like I could just Google it, but in my brain. And so I'm sure other Neuralink users, you can connect to one another and talk to each other telepathically. And again, what does this have to do with psychedelics? Not so much in terms of the medical treatments and the chips, like that is not the same obviously, but telepathy, as weird as it sounds, again, ayahuasca, the tea that was brewed that contains DMT, there have been multiple accounts of users actually reporting telepathic experiences, which to somebody that has never experienced it and or doesn't really know what kind of environment that would have happened in, it seems absolutely crazy, and I'm sure a lot of people agree with that statement. However, the fact that more than just one person or more than just one group of people reported having telepathic communication while on this substance is interesting, to say the least. Because that kind of goes back to how a lot of these psychedelics activate our brains significantly more than at resting state. So maybe what Elon is trying to achieve by letting you utilize this artificial chip and connect it to your brain and kind of like change everything in your brain that way, maybe psychedelics have kind of been doing the same thing. Obviously, there's no proof that telepathy with psychedelics is real. However, personal accounts, in my opinion at least, are quite valuable when it comes to things like this. Because, again, like I've said probably many times, these experiences with psychedelics can really be life-changing for a lot of people. So it's not too far-fetched to see that maybe somebody did actually experience telepathy and they truly believe it. just like some people might see God, and they also truly feel, and not only did they see, but then after the experience, they really feel like they did experience that type of God. So it's kind of interesting to think about. And that was it. It's very futuristic as of now, obviously, because we don't have that kind of technology. And then when you talk about using psychedelics and group telepathy, still sounds very strange, and we don't really understand what is going on there.
Just to like say something quick.
Yeah.
For people experiencing like a schizophrenia episode, like I forgot what it's called. They genuinely feel and think there are bugs crawling on their skin. So with this as well as maybe the drugs could be, they genuinely feel like they're having a conversation, but like it's not actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
How is it to guarantee that this telepathy feature in this technology is not just thought? And
No,
it's
yeah,
actually happening?
totally agree, because again, the whole argument of like brain connectivity increasing, it can also prove, or try to prove in that direction as well, because maybe when your brain is just being connected in all sorts of places, you're experiencing and hearing, doing things that aren't there. And yeah, that is what has been happening in terms of the physical experience of it all, but the fact that, I think it's just the fact that throughout time, these kinds of similar experiences have all been recorded by different individuals that don't even know each other is pretty cool, considering like they might all come from different backgrounds, and when you consider it in the context of indigenous peoples using it for ceremonial purposes, I think inherently they were already very spiritual people. I'm talking in a general sense, but yeah. So ones that did have this sense of spirituality, they all still kind of like felt similar things to maybe someone that done something similar today. And yeah, I don't really know how to explain that, but also yeah, I don't think it can be explained that those experiences are definitively real either. Just because of the nature of how they work, how psychedelics work. Yeah. Anyways, did anyone else have any other questions? I've been talking for a long time.
I think the reporting of similar experiences kind of mimics like replication and experimentation. Of course, not in like a controlled setting, but it has like some validation in that way.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so that's why I think, although, like with the internet, a lot of users probably share their personal accounts on various websites and forums. Like with everything on the internet, should probably be taken with a grain of salt, because anyone can be telling anything. However, when something profound like a psychedelic experience actually changes someone's life, it kind of raises the question of like, how is it changing so many people's lives and in such a similar kind of way? And yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of downsides that I have talked about in terms of the legal status and troubles to change that legal status, as well as what we had talked about in the other presentations, being the market of psychedelics, and it's actually already kind of starting to not look good because there are private for-profit companies in the States that are kind of attempting to monopolize psilocybin, competing directly against non-profit organizations trying to research psilocybin. So already you're kind of seeing the really rich people swoop in, they see this potential, and they're trying to control it, which is not great, but remaining hopeful, these things could, if in some world psychedelics are widely accepted and used in different medical therapies. Of course, we would have new treatments for depression and all those mental health disorders that a lot of people don't actually respond to traditional treatments, like traditional antidepressants and such. And the next one being cultural understanding and acceptance. So having so many people experience a sense of, or having their ego kind of dissolved a little bit, causing them to accept others more openly is very valuable in today's day and age, because a lot of conflict that may arise between groups of people or individuals even likely comes from misunderstanding and not an unwillingness to even attempt to understand the other party. So that is one thing that might be increased. I don't know how that would work on a global scale, but anyways, and I put decreasing criminal activity here, just as like a kind of thought, because a lot of criminals are mentally ill, and like psychopaths, sociopaths, that may, and where their mental state may worsen to the point where they commit criminal activity, sometimes at a very large scale, that obviously impacts the public and everyone's safety a lot. So if we have a very efficient therapy with psychedelics, that could possibly change, because some of these criminals probably either didn't seek treatment or they tried the other medicines and they didn't like them, didn't work, you know, it's discouraging. Those things are all very different from psychedelics in the fact that they don't provide that whole experience. And lastly, just to know more things. I think it would be very cool if we could keep researching and seeing what they can be used for, how they affect our bodies, and yeah. I am finished, so if you have any more questions.
So David Crippen is sort of internet leader in critical care medicine, and he and I started internet resources at the same time and so on. But we're sort of exactly opposite people. Very, very opposite. If you can imagine somebody who's completely the opposite of me. And Timothy Leary, who was sort of a big guy known for LSD, who promoted LSD use. So David Crippen was his personal physician for the last few years of his life. And David Crippen had long hair, he knew all the cool musical groups and the groupies in the 60s, and he lived as a part of that culture and so on. His personal life was so turbulent that his girlfriend told him he was a loser, and so he went to Vietnam with that message. And he was extremely brave. He got a lot of medals during the Vietnam War. Now, I've never been in the military, I've never got any medals for bravery, but in civilian life, he hasn't won any medals, and I so we're very different. But anyway, for a long time I felt jealous of him because he'd had all these experiences that I hadn't had. He had a rock band, I didn't have a rock band, and his rock band would perform at medical conferences and so on. But because life is fair, I mean, you may not believe life is fair, but he and I are sort of comparable in age, but now he's had a lot of medical problems. He broke his Achilles tendon, he's fractured a hip and so on, and he is retired, and he's sort of on the outs with the place where he used to work. They have sort of broken off contact with him, so it's not such a cool story, because if I remained jealous of him and he was this totally cool guy throughout the whole story, it would be much cooler. But so doing drugs, I think, probably does have or can have some long-term effects. he's probably one example of that. So the reason that he didn't stay the winner and I didn't remain jealous of him the whole time probably has to do with some of the adverse effects. So that needs to be balanced. But I think that indeed the whole medical establishment now regards psychedelics as more of a legitimate area to look at now than it used to be. That in the 60s, you're quite right, that the hippies were experimenting with this stuff, and there was a lot of prejudice against people just like David Crippen and the sex, drugs, and rock and roll scene, and so on. So, anyway, other questions?
I mean, I think what Dr. Solis was talking about it is very important to distinguish between, a bunch of teenagers on the weekend bored ordering something offline or online versus legalizing it and then having it being used in a medical establishment. I'm sure, as many of you probably can guess, it's not the same being in a doctor's office having somebody supervise and a safe, controlled environment than getting something random that you don't know where you're getting it from. And I mean, that raises the whole problem of drug prohibition in general, because people will be getting the illicit substances one way or another, and arguably, putting themselves more at risk for having adverse reactions because they just don't know what they're getting exactly. And yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, I feel like, drug prohibition and why it's good and not good, but I don't know, is there any other questions?
Okay, very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.